Hi everybody, it's Ms. Cole again, and this is going to be a video about literature. And some people perhaps have wondered why I started a literature series without talking about like the classics. And so I started thinking about, what all I wanted to say about classics and what I thought about them and what students seem to think about them and what the general public seems to think about them and, what makes something a classic. And it got really long. So this is actually going to be a two-part video or a two-part series, but it's going to be two videos. Anyway, so the first is going to look at what we mean by classic literature. That's this one. So quite often from students, I get, if not the direct question, at least the attitude of, why do we have to read this? And there are some common complaints from students, and they're not without merit. So some of the common complaints that I hear from or in the vicinity of students, because they're sweet and they don't want to make me feel bad, bless their little hearts, it's difficult, which is true. But of course, part of that's just school. So, it is what it is. Sorry, kids. They don't just say what they mean. There's no point. Oh, and if there is a point, they spend too long getting to it and they don't make it clearly, which, goes back to the idea of they don't just say what they mean. The characters and situations aren't relevant to my life. It's boring, which I think is connected to the previous items. For example, perhaps you've never sat through a church service of several hours in length, held entirely in a language with which you were completely unfamiliar. Yeah, try that. Imagine what it would have been like at 11 years old. Let me tell you, suffering patiently through something completely incomprehensible absolutely sucks. So I get it. I do. It's too long. And then having difficulty with it makes it take even longer. Other stuff is more important. AKA, I've got more important to do. Also known as the hierarchy of needs, to put it in teacher lingo. Or it has limited practical application. Sometimes this is devoted to anything that's not just literature, but all sorts of any fiction, poetry, art, just in general, that it doesn't have a practical application. And again, see point above about, things that I gotta do. So those are all things that we're going to look at as far as why students think this. It's not just a defect of some sort, not to like literature. It's understandable. There are reasons for this. And there are also things that can help us as teachers and as students to address these challenges that literature faces us with. So some things, as I was thinking through and looking at how readers and writers describe classic literature. Of course, there's the Mark Twain quote where he says that a classic is a book that everybody praises but nobody's actually read. Joan Didion talks about shared experience, that a classic is something that everybody knows, like Romeo and Juliet. Everybody knows Romeo and Juliet, right? And that's part of what makes it a classic. It's that shared experience. But one of the explanations that I like best came from someone named Clifton Fadiman. And he said, when you read a classic, you do not see more in the book than you did before. You see more in you than you saw before. And I just really liked that. I think it goes beyond just yourself. It can also help you see the world in a different way. But often when we talk about art in general, and specifically art that endures, it has some effect on us. And a lot of that is about perspective, not just our perspective of the work, but the way it causes us to think about ourselves and the world in a new way. When we talk about the classics, sometimes you'll also hear reference to the canon. Those are two very different things. Let's be really clear on that. although sometimes it feels like they're used in similar ways. So the canon consists of works that are widely thought not only to illustrate the influence of the culture and the era in which they were created, but to exert their own influence as well, in particular, beyond the form and into society and history. So, for example, while I personally think that George Orwell's 1984 has inconsistent characterization and is overly preachy and heavy-handed in its theme, its broader cultural influence is easily visible. The novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. The legend is that upon meeting Harriet Beecher Stowe, President Lincoln said, "So, you're the little woman who wrote the book that started this big war." Kind of paternalistic. But the influence of the book is hard to deny. And then possibly the most influential book ever would be the King James Bible. Well, it was Henry VIII who actually broke with the Catholic Church. It was one of his successors later, James I or James VI. It depends on how you're counting, who arguably made a bigger historical splash by commissioning a translation of the Bible from the Latin Vulgate to what was then the language of regular people, modern English, which didn't make it accessible to just like everybody, because back then a lot of people, it was very common for the common people to not be able to read. And also, this would have been before the invention of the printing press. So it's not like there were all of a sudden Bibles everywhere. The Gutenberg Bible is also very important in terms of getting it out to everybody. But just the idea that scripture should be available in the common language is revolutionary. And its influence is still felt today. There are, ironically, some people who cling to the King James Version of the Bible as somehow authoritative, even though it's a translation, and some have even argued that it's a paraphrase. Nevertheless, its historical influence has been indescribable. So next we want to think about who gets to pick. Who decides what makes a work a classic? And what issues of provenance and privilege does that raise? The short answer is mostly it's been the people who have financial freedom to become literary scholars. And in addition, the power and the influence to have other people accept what they say as influential and authoritative. And please, if you're surprised, you shouldn't be. They're nearly always rich white dudes. Is there a pattern here? Short answer, yes. Yes, there is. The historical legacy of that, is something that we need to be aware of. The well-known name Harold Bloom, of the great books. I don't know, it almost takes a sort of arrogance to say, well, I know what a great book is. But even beyond the deciders, there are also concerns about lack of diversity based on who has the opportunity to create, produce, and distribute artistic work, as well as what kinds of work actually constitute art. For example, carpentry. Like, obviously, woodworking can be artistic, but there's, because there's a practical element to it as well, more functional woodworking and carpentry tends to be seen as less artistic, even when well made. And so, that brings about that sort of question. With literature, there's less of an issue because, literature tends to be non-utilitarian. But, the stories we tell each other about our day, diaries. Are diaries art? Are they literature? All of those are valid questions and fun to explore. So we've thought about who gets to choose what makes something a great work, and who gets to create. But we also want to think about how someone chooses, what elements or factors make something classic. So some of the common themes that you'll hear teachers talk about, or scholars or other students, include things like this. Great works, classics, often include universal truths about the nature of life or society or human nature. In some way, a classic work is revelatory. I mentioned this earlier, that it's about perception. You see things that you hadn't noticed before. You realize things that were already there, but it hadn't been available to you in that way. They are experiential. Reading them, putting yourself into that is an experience, it's not just a process. They are relevant to a broad variety of people, and they are, in a sense, almost like video games can be. They're replayable, especially to people in different cultures and eras and life stages. This is what makes a work, the phrase stand the test of time. When you can go back to a work as an adult and something that you loved as a child and pick it up and look at it and it's still good, that's a feature of greatness. I can't tell you how many times I've been a little bit afraid to go back to things that I loved as a child because I'm like, but what if they weren't any good and I just didn't know better? What if I just liked them because, I was just a dumb kid? And sadly, sometimes that's the case. I'm fortunate in that I've gotten better over the years at forgiving myself. And so I'm still able to appreciate, if not even sometimes enjoy them, as much as for a reminder of who I have been in the past, as for any dubious claims of quality in the work itself. But when you go back to something that you loved as a child, my go-to is the Anne series, Anne of Green Gables, Anne of Avonlea, all that stuff. Still good, still great, still awesome. And I relate to it in a different way now. But it's definitely something that I can come back to and appreciate in a different way. Now that I'm older, I have different experiences. It definitely helps to have not just good quality, but exceptional quality, something where all of the parts individually are well crafted. Like for literature, there's good characters and, strong, believable characters, interesting characters, a variety of different types, but also a plot that, flows naturally. One event leads to the next. You see that cause and effect, and there's suspense, and, you want to know what happens next. And then the detail is beautiful. It's not just dumped on you, but woven into what happens fluidly. And, the description is clear and vivid. And so each individual element is well done. And yet, when you put it all together, somehow it's even greater as a whole work than just being the sum of its parts. In this sense, it also is common for a classic work to be considered exemplary of its form. This is like, if you want to know what a novel is, look at this. This shows you what it means to be a novel. And that would have been more true for early novels when people were still working with the form. You see a lot more change, for example, in poetry throughout the years. Different types of poems. This is what a sonnet is. This is what a limerick is. This is what a haiku is. I have a really fun lesson with my students where I have a limerick where it's, the 5 lines, but it is very quiet and introspective and it's about nature. And then I have a haiku that is, the 575, but it's short and pithy and clever. And so students learn that it's not just about the external elements of the form, it's also about the tone and the style as well, and we talk about that. Artists will play with form, and that leads into my next point. It helps, although it's not required, for a classic work to be experimental or even playful. It's like it's exploratory, saying, exactly where are the rules here? Where are the boundaries? And what happens if we do this? And how far can you push before it doesn't count as a novel anymore? How short can a novel be? How long can a novel be? What if we write a novel and we don't use the most common letter in the alphabet for this language? And there are writers who do that just to see what happens. What happens when you limit yourself in this ways? Not for the arrogance necessarily of being unique and different, but just to find out what happens if you bend or twist or tweak expectations in certain ways. And sometimes they break. And you end up with something that's just this monstrosity. But then later authors and creators will come along and be like, that's kind of interesting. And they can build on that. So quality and exploration often can be combined into influence. Others see what this artist has accomplished and they follow their lead and do other interesting things with the form. So finally, I want to bring up the point that a classic doesn't have to be dense or challenging. There are classic children's books such as Where the Wild Things Are, The Velveteen Rabbit, Strega Nona, The Very Hungry Caterpillar, or, pretty much the entire library of Dr. Seuss. Actually, I book talked a Dr. Seuss book down in another series. But if we look through them, if we look at these children's works, even though they're not difficult, we can appreciate the artistry within them and we can see why these particular stories, and in this case, the artwork that has gone with them as well, has helped them to be a classic. So as you are beginning or continuing your study of classic art, and in particular classic literature, I hope this has been helpful for you. If you are interested, like, subscribe, all that good YouTube-y stuff. But what would really, really just make me smile to no end is if you told me some of your favorite classics down in the comments. I will be following up with some exploration of why we study classics in the video that's going to be the companion to this one. But for now, it's time to take a break. Thanks so much for doing this with me. Bye, everybody.